Welcome to the Diversity Pivot Podcast. I'm your host, Julie Kratz. This season, we're having sweaty conversations for change. We're talking with guests about uncomfortable conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion needed to pivot towards positive change. We do this podcast because it's important that all voices are heard, all people are seen, and all people feel a sense of belonging in their workplaces. Let's meet this week's guest. Welcome back to the Diversity Pivot Podcast. We're honored to have a guest with us, an author that's written about allyship and women's leadership. Her name is Hira Ali, and she's author of the renowned book, Her Way to the Top, A Guide to Smashing the Glass Ceiling, which was received international awards and outstanding testimonials worldwide. She's also an inspiring and well-organized leadership expert and career coach who's impacted thousands from a variety of industries. She's had the opportunity to be featured in Forbes, Huffington Post, The Female Lead, and many more. She's also featured as a role model in the books Girls Who Want to Be alongside Ariana Huffington, Reshma Saujani. I love those people's work. Some great esteemed colleagues there. And she's very passionate about empowering women and ethnic minorities and closing the gender gap as a strong advocate of diversity and inclusion. She's also Chief Executive Officer of Advancing Your Potential, Managing Director of the International Women Empowerment Events, and co-founder of the Career Excel and co-founder of the Gray Area. She's based in the UK, and we'll dive into all of her tools, books, and stories in this episode. Hira, welcome.
Hi, Julie. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I love your podcast.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm curious. This season, we've been kicking off with kind of what we're calling these candid conversations about diversity and inclusion. And I'm sure doing the work you do and the speaking that you've done and the coaching you've done, you've probably heard some doozies over the years.
Yes.
Kick us off with something, a story and something that happened that could give our listeners a little bit of a window into your world.
All right. So honestly, I have so many because I have traveled from country to country, and I'm originally from Pakistan, where I was working, and then I was working in Dubai. And then I moved to London. So I've built my leadership brand, and I've been working on diversity inclusion in different countries. So every country that I have worked in, I've encountered different kinds of people with who asked me all sorts of odd questions. But I think the recent one is, I mean, it's not really an odd question. I guess it's those typical microaggressions when you see somebody who doesn't fit in the culture. So you ask them, where you're originally from, and how is your English so good? And I told them I've done my O levels and A levels, and they were like, what? You have that kind of education in the country that you're from. So it was just, it's really funny because, it's all about lack of awareness. And I think what was really strange was when I was called a militant feminist because I called out something which wasn't good. I called out sexist behaviors, and I called out sexist banter a couple of times in a few places that I was in. That, and I guess the final one was that the reason why I'm into women leadership is because probably I'm not able to handle men very well, and I'm not able to train and coach men. So that's why I do the easy stuff, and that's women leadership. So that was really strange because, why would I do that?
I can imagine, the misperceptions that people have about Pakistan, for example, and your cultural heritage, and I don't think people understand, while they may be thinking they're well-intentioned, they're just curious about you and trying to place you and understand you. Asking questions like, where are you from, is very othering to somebody, because it's really signaling, I see you and I see your skin color, I see your accent, and that's all I see of you, rather than your full human self. And these microaggressions, like you said, like, oh, wow, I'm surprised, your English is so good, you're so articulate, or you have this advanced education, like being surprised that we would not be that same level of surprised if it was, say, a white straight guy, displaying his credentials, you're like, oh yeah, of course. So it is hurtful. It is harmful, despite the fact that I think sometimes allies do have good intentions when they ask those questions.
Yes.
And I know, Hira, you're really passionate like us about allyship and how to be there for people that are different than yourself. I'm curious from the ethnic lens, and you really have the intersectional lens of gender and ethnicity, but I'm
Yes.
curious from like the multi-ethnic lens, especially knowing your work, how might you recommend folks be better allies for people of different ethnicities than themselves?
That is such a good question, Julie, and a very valid one, because I do feel that sometimes when we are talking about particularly gender allyship, unintentionally we tend to overlook women of color. And I think one thing which often happens is that people see intersectionality as the oppression Olympics. So they believe that, oh my God, it's all about who has it the worst. And it's not about that, honestly speaking. I think intersectionality is all about not observing challenges from a single categorical axis, because that becomes problematic, and it often obscures discrete sources of discrimination. So for example, when you're talking about gender discrimination, the racial contours may be overlooked or not given due importance. So I think it, as allies, it's really important to understand that every community has unique challenges, right? So whether it's a Black woman or Asian woman, a Muslim women, or trans women, sometimes women, and I'm speaking from the point of view of women here, because women particularly fall into double or triple minorities, which means that sometimes they can be, they can be marginalized much more as compared to, for example, a white woman. So I think for allies, it's just important to understand that it's not just about how multiple forms of oppression are experienced simultaneously, but it's about how some women, unfortunately, because they fall in several minority groups. For example, it could be a Black woman who's also Muslim or who also has a disability. What happens is that some of these multiple forms of oppression are very inextricable and they're intertwined. So you can't actually tell them apart, or you can't distinguish where one stops and the other begins. And I think that's what we really need to be careful about.
Yeah, those intersectional lenses. And you're right. I mean, so well put, the danger of just looking at diversity from one lens, one single category. And just, it's not like the diversity Olympics. Like you said, it's not like
Yes,
no one wins by having more
yes,
dimensions of
yes, yes.
diversity. It's not a contest. It's not a pity party. This is really just understanding the complexities of the lived experiences of people with intersectional lenses of difference.
Absolutely. And I think it's important not to make assumptions of different communities that that we interact with, or different minority groups that we interact with. And nobody is saying that, if you belong to a privileged group, you haven't experienced those challenges. I mean, nobody's saying that at all. I'm sure you've had your own fair share of challenges. I think what is only being said is that you probably haven't gone through the same challenges as people from the minority groups. It's just, a bit of awareness and being empathetic towards that. And I think that can go a long way about trying to understand people for their unique identity, and not making assumptions about habits or preferences or choices or even aptitude based on their gender or race or faith or ethnicity.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. Allies, I think, are good at pausing and slowing down that bias that can creep in and making those assumptions about people based on other people you might have known that looked like them or thought like them or behaved like them in the past. It's really getting to know people as individual people. And I'm
Absolutely.
curious here, like how might someone, I think a big question I get, I think, from well-intentioned allies is, well, I want to get to know somebody that's different than me, but like maybe I don't have that relationship yet. And I'm afraid of saying you're doing the wrong thing. How might someone get to know somebody as an ally without overstepping
Yes.
and, creating that awkwardness and
Yes.
being too invasive of their privacy?
Absolutely. So, you know what? Julie, I think first of all, we all need to recognize this, that being an ally doesn't mean that you have all the information and you have all the answers. And you are allowed to make mistakes, because let me tell you something, chances are that you probably will make a mistake. There will be a faux pas or a gaffe at the organization, which is absolutely fine. I think what is important is to recognize that you've made a mistake, acknowledge your responsibility, rather than using half-hearted cover-ups, because people will recognize if you're being genuinely apologetic as versus making excuses or assuming positive intent. So I answered this question yesterday also. In fact, I was at Sky Network, and one of the people said, and how do you get to know people? And I guess the best way is to ask the right questions, because if you don't ask the right questions, you probably would never know. So it's better to know what you should say and how you can help people from minority groups rather than being ignorant. I attended a D&I panel, and one of the panelists said that sometimes people are so scared of being offensive that in that process they're actually being offensive, right? Because they don't say anything at all. So I would say just ask the right questions, respectful questions, naturally curious and genuinely interested questions, not something which obviously oversteps or might seem as if you are trying to intrude or crossing personal boundaries. But just naturally curious questions, I think everybody would be happy to answer. I mean, mostly people would be happy to answer those.
Yeah. I always think about elements of culture, and I'm always careful not to ask too many probing questions too quick. But like you said, like real curiosity, really genuine, authentic. And yeah, you might bumble and stumble and make a mistake. That's okay. Allies that are doing this work, you're doing it right. If you're doing it wrong, sometimes that makes sense. But asking people questions about their culture, right? What type of holidays do you celebrate? What kind of food do you enjoy eating? Rather than an example I've used before, like my Asian American friends, people go like, oh, you people will say, you must love Chinese food or egg rolls. Like that's a fairly big assumption that you're placing on that person. And, they might not even be from China. There's a lot of countries in Asia. So to your point, I think really leaning in, being curious about those differences and asking them in a polite, truly authentic, genuine way, that's going to land. And people, like you said, will be happy to answer questions like that come from a good place. But there's such a slippery slope there where it starts to feel inappropriate.
Yes, it does. And I guess it is tricky, to be honest, because a lot of people might not even like those basic questions, which you think are harmless, right? So it really
That's
does.
True. That's true.
It really does depend on person to person. It might not land well, even though your intentions were good. So I would say in that situation, don't be afraid to make mistakes. If your intentions are genuine, and if you do feel that the other person didn't like it, then offer an apology straight away. And I think the more you say things, the more you will learn through experience, because this is something which will happen once you enter more and more uncomfortable conversations, because it will not happen if you don't say anything at all.
Yeah. Yeah. We always say, build some trust first, get to know people before you ask challenging questions. And you're right. I mean, holidays, for example, that could be a very personal thing, somebody's religious faith or spirituality. So you're right. Yeah. I appreciate that correction. Here, shifting gears a little bit, I know you've written some books about allyship and for women in the workplace to move beyond barriers. I'm curious, like, where do you see this conversation with diversity and inclusion? How do you see it advancing, and how is your work supporting that?
Okay, so that's a great question, Julie. When I published my first book, Her Way to the Top, A Guide to Smashing the Glass Ceiling, I talked about two things. I talked about internal and external barriers, because a lot of times people would say, and again, I talk from the point of view of gender, like, women probably do not need any fixing in their confidence level. They're already quite good. It's the organizations that need to do something, they need to do something substantial in order to make sure that women feel included. And on the other hand, there were a lot of women who felt that, yes, confidence was also an issue, because clearly research shows, and I have also interviewed so many people, that women do enter the workforce far less confident than their male counterparts. So I guess for me, it was important to talk about both things and realize that it's internal and external challenges that hold women back in their career. And then I realized that, after I'd written this book, a lot of people would say, well, okay, great, you've written this book, we have all the tips, but how about men? What should men do? Right? and that's why I decided to move the conversation from what women can do to what men can do, right? How men can support. And I know you have also written a great book on that, Julie. And there's several books out there which do focus on this. How can men be great allies to women? And I was seeing this in every country that I worked in: Dubai, Pakistan, US, UK. All these people, they were well-intentioned men who wanted to support the conversation. So that's why I then moved the conversation to allyship. And now what I believe, Julie, is that I believe in collective efforts. I believe that we all need to play a part in this. Yes, male allies primarily, but it has to be the organization, it has to be the education institutes, it has to be the government policies, also religious institutes, in some of the countries where religion plays a dominant role. All these institutions need to be involved in order for women to progress. And also other minority groups, not just women, because, it's not just women who are subjected to discrimination. Of course, there are other racial or other minority groups that experience discrimination and bias. So I think that's what I'm working towards. I really want everybody to work on this, not just, of course, male allies, yes, but, women themselves, of course, need to step up, be more bold, be more confident. But at the same time, we need to make sure that they're pro-government policies, because government intervention is so important. Most of the European countries are progressing because, they have such great laws there that are in favor of women, like non-transferable paternity leaves and, great childcare.
Yeah.
So things like that.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we're woefully behind on that here in the United States. It's a huge point of contention. And
Yes.
I believe that, along with sexual harassment,
Yes.
having a zero tolerance policy, until we move past those two systemic barriers, it's going to continue to be difficult for women. And we're seeing COVID has very much exacerbated that, just like many things have. But here, I love the conversation we're having about, it reminds me of like self versus systems. There's work that we can do on ourselves, right? As women,
Yes.
folks of different cultural identities. I think you can do some work to get your head in the game, lead with confidence, have the right, leadership style, all those things, which you and I talk about, but
Yes.
it's the systems a lot of times that need to change. And I think sometimes that's really overwhelming and daunting for an ally to think, how am I supposed to influence these systems? How am I supposed to help our HR team see that we need inclusive leave and we need, to really look at the employee experience and from an inclusive lens. I'm curious, for folks that might be inside organizations where they could influence systemic change, what would be some systems that might be helpful to either raise up as an ally or to question as an ally, or really just to inspect and see what's really going on?
Yes, definitely. So in my book, Her Allies, a practical toolkit to help men lead through advocacy, it was launched in UK last month, and will be launched in US in October. I mean, the online book is already there. So in that, I talk about 4 things. I say, whatever your position in the organization, of course, when you are senior, then you have more influence to impact decisions and enact changes. But irrespective of the fact that whatever your position, right, whatever your department, you don't have to be a diversity inclusion professional. You don't have to be an HR practitioner or an organization leader. Whatever position you're in, right, whatever you experience, in your own way, there are things you can do. And I talk about challenging yourself first, acknowledging bias, acknowledging responsibility, recognizing privilege, and a number of things. And then I say, then you move on to challenge others. Respectfully call out, instances where people are being, sexist or homophobic or transphobic or racist. So how to respectfully challenge others. And then you move on to challenging the organization culture. And in that, it's just about looking at everything, Julie. And you also talk about this, right? Recruitment and appraisal and diverse, events, even how to make events more diverse, and appraisals and leadership. Just look at everything. Perform a cultural audit and see how you can create awareness. Even if you can't do it directly yourself, you can at least create awareness about it when you're talking in a room full of people. And the final thing is, and that's on a bigger level, that's challenging the institution. And that's calling out media bias. That's championing, pro-government policies. That's advocating for inclusive education. So it's I give everybody like this whole toolkit in which they start by challenging themselves and they go on to ultimately challenging the institution. And I think every individual can do that in their own capacity.
Yeah. Oh, there's some great ways to lead from where you're at. I think a lot of times people think that they don't have as much power, influence because of their title or the place in the organization they sit in. And, I think of some wonderful examples that have happened over the last few years and the rise of Me Too and Black Lives Matter and these movements that are much beyond hashtags. It's the everyday conversations that are happening inside organizations. I mean, you think about Google, for example, employees staged a walkout with demands of what their organization needed to do to get better. And that all started, I'm guessing from a single person, a conversation that sparked a huge, huge part of their employee base really advocating for social change. So one conversation can light the fire of an organization.
Definitely.
And we need accountability, like you said. I mean, people need to be held accountable. Organizations need to be held accountable. And on the other side of this, like the business results are there too. So it's kind of an obvious thing and right thing to do for humans and for business to support this. But oftentimes we don't because we're protecting the status quo. We're keeping things the same because it's worked that way in the past. And that's the enemy of diversity, I believe, is the status quo.
I think the biggest enemy, Julie, I've come across is after writing my second book, particularly, is the behavior intention gap, where you really want to do well, you have all the right intentions, but that does not translate into positive action.
Nope.
And of course, there are a number of things which hold allies back, but I personally believe that the way to go ahead with this, if you really are sincere, is to find your own personal why. And I know you also, Julie, talk about it because I've quoted you in my book too, in this book, where you talk about, finding the organization why. And I think it also goes down to finding your own personal why. Like, it's really good. Diversity and inclusion is generally better for everyone, not just from a financial perspective and global perspective. McKinsey has all this research which says you're going to add $12 billion to the economy, which is all very good. But individually, you are so liberated, from you get financial freedom, you have the liberty to look after your children, you don't have to be that macho man anymore.
I know and that's so freeing for all human beings to lift out of this and think beyond these categories, these arbitrary gender boxes that we've drawn over the years that just don't work anymore if they ever did. I'm curious, thinking about how to be an ally and how to be an ally from a multicultural lens. I know you do a lot of work with gender and understanding what it means to be a male ally. And I'm curious and thinking about, increasingly what we're seeing here in the United States is this precipitous growth of multicultural folks, not just biracial, but multiracial now as the biggest growth area ethnically here, which is exciting.
Yes.
And I have well-intentioned allies tell me okay, that'll solve the problem. See, but we will have no white majority and we'll all multiracial will be the biggest majority. Okay, problem solved just by representation. It's more complicated than that, right?
Exactly, yes.
And I know you're seeing this across the pond too, just this increasingly diverse ethnic blend that is beautiful, but also not I don't think is gonna solve the problem.
No, definitely not. It has to be deeper than that. It can't be like just tokenism or, on a superficial level, you're just hitting the right numbers and saying, oh, wow, we have a multicultural force right now. So I think, in terms of allies, I would just say that, understand this, that the racially diverse groups that you work with, they might not fit the stereotypes society defines for that particular group. So avoid clustering communities and the respective issues, and it's also very helpful to understand that majority of women and marginalized groups have likely experienced prejudice at some point in their life. Everybody has, right? But there's certain challenges which will be very unique to specific ethnicities. So, for example, Black women's experience is going to be very different from an Asian woman's experience, or a Muslim woman's experience is going to be very different, from another woman. So I guess we have to understand. We can't generalize, cluster, digress, or dilute the barriers respective community faces. So, sometimes some people experience multiple disadvantages, right? Because of gender, faith, ability, socioeconomic background. So, for example, a Black Muslim woman, she may experience prejudice based on skin color, gender, and faith. So I guess, as allies, the first step we can do is to avoid stereotyping and generalizing, and understanding unique experiences and identities.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. I love going back to don't make those assumptions, watch the stereotypes, and really challenge yourself to be curious instead in a respectful way. Hira, I'm curious about just your work and this wonderful book that's coming out this fall, that is out for audience to check out. Tell us more about the book and what to expect in reading that.
Okay, so the book is has so far received, and thankfully, a lot of media coverage as well. I have written many articles on it as well, in Independent and Telegraph and Harper's Bazaar and BBC. Lots of different publications have featured it. The book it's basically it. What it is it's a toolkit which offers men the strategies they need to become powerful advocates for gender equality. And what it essentially does is it's an invitation to all men who are willing to take that bold first step and transform good intention into meaningful action. And when the readers will find themselves, whoever buys the book and reads the book, they will find themselves embarking on a progressive journey. It starts with challenging yourself, as I already mentioned, and you move on to challenging others, and then you start challenging the organization culture, and ultimately you challenge the institution. And the allies here will not be committed to this journey for personal gain, of course. I mean, yes, the personal why might be there, but these people would probably know that their children and grandchildren are going to reap the rewards of their efforts. So there are lots of different strategies in every section, and I have made this into. And I've tried to make this relevant to all the countries that I worked in, because I'm currently based in the UK, but I'm originally from Pakistan. I've also worked in UAE. So I wanted to write something which women from all countries and men from all countries could relate to across different cultures. So I'm hoping that you will find this advice to be very relevant, irrespective of your background, faith, gender. And I think women are going to find, they're going to enjoy reading this book too, because Julie, as you might be aware, as women, sometimes we can have biases too.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, just as folks in different racial groups can have bias against their own racial groups. Like, we're all living in this world. We're subjected to gender and racial and ethnic stereotypes every day. So we're all very much absorbing that, and got to be cognizant of them to be able to manage them. So really great tools. I can't wait for that. Listeners to be sure to check out the book. And Hira, before we go today, ways that our listeners can follow and connect with you.
All right, so I'm very active on LinkedIn. So on LinkedIn, my personal profile is Hira Ali Coach, but otherwise my company profiles on Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter is @AdvancingYou. That's the handle. And my main company website is www.advancingyourpotential.com. So the handle for Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram is @AdvancingYou, and the website is advancingyourpotential.com.
Awesome. Advancingyourpotential.com. We'll be sure to link to that in the show notes, listeners, so you can get in touch with Hira and follow her work. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Julie. It was such a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for listening to the Diversity Pivot podcast. Allies are necessary for positive change. If you're on the journey to becoming an ally, we invite you to participate in our new signature Lead Like an Ally online self-paced learning program. It's comprehensive, and it includes an online learning platform packed with tools, stories, and ideas to become an even better ally. Head over to leadlikeanally.com to learn more.